Welcome to the Westar Institute's Bible Search and Rescue podcast. My name is Chad Vinters. I'm the host of Bible Search and Rescue, and I am pumped today because we have got an incredible guest with us. We're going to be talking to Dr. Steve Hassan, who is an expert on cults and the processes of control in which cults use to bring people in and to gain control over them. So, Dr. Hassan, how are you doing today?
Just a bit of a head cold, so apologies for the raspiness, but always happy to share my expertise of the last 50 plus years.
Absolutely. And as you can see behind Dr. Hassan, he's got several of his books that he's done, including Combating Mind Control, The Cult of Trump, Freedom of Mind. Outstanding author who, by the way, has a pretty incredible background that led him to becoming someone who helps to heal those who have been damaged by cultic mentality and behavior. So, Dr. Hassan, just wanted to start by asking you the question, how did all of this get started? What happened to you when you were young that led you to this path?
Right. Well, Chad, I guess you can say I have a wounded healer storyline.
Yeah.
Grew up in Flushing, Queens, New York, working class family. Uh, normal, healthy parents, never divorced, never gambled, never had affairs, just like boringly normal. I was an extra honor student, and I had a situational vulnerability where a girlfriend abruptly broke up with me.
Hmm.
And I was sitting in the cafeteria at Queens College waiting for classes to start for the spring semester. I was kind of lonely. And three women started flirting with me, and they said they were students,
Mm.
and I asked them if they were part of a religious group, which was very interesting that I even had that question.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know why, but they said, "Oh no, not at all. Both were lies."
Hmm.
And because we have a lot of territory to cover, I'll just jump to the chase. I got inveigled into a Korean cult called the Moonies. The leader, who's now deceased, Sun Myung Moon, claimed to be 10 times greater than Jesus Christ, uh, claimed to be the Messiah, did all these mass weddings where he would assign people to each other, claiming that he knew everything about their spiritual backgrounds because he was so spiritually developed, etc. They picked me up as a leader because I could give lectures, I guess, and recruit others. So I got to be in on a lot of very important meetings where he talked about infiltrating the government and how God thinks democracy is satanic and we have to create a
Hmm.
theocracy to rule the world. And even on another occasion, he said that when we take power in America, we'll amend the Constitution and make it a capital offense if people break our rules,
Hmm.
particularly around sexuality, because
Ah.
they're very strict about that. No extramarital affairs, and anti-gay, I should add. So the long story short is that I was so taken over. I dropped out of college, quit my job, donated my bank account. My family was Satan. Everybody in the outside world was evil unless I could bring them into God's movement. I was a true believer. And in my story, what led to my exit was a near fatal van crash due to sleep
Hmm.
exhaustion. I was sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night regularly, 7 days a week, but I went 3 days
Hmm.
without sleep at all and drove into the back of a tractor trailer truck on the Baltimore Beltway, which led me to be in the hospital away from the group for several weeks which led me to call my sister. I have two older sisters. I called my sister, the only one who didn't say I was in a cult and I was brainwashed, I might add, because
Mm,
when people would say things like that, then they were obviously of the devil or some demon was possessing them, I thought.
mhm,
And she persuaded me. She said, "You have a nephew you haven't met. I want him to know his Uncle Stevie. Come, I'll take care of you." So I made her promise not to tell my parents or our oldest sister, but she broke that promise, fortunately. And that led to a deprogramming intervention, not because I had any doubts. I had no doubts consciously. I knew I was doing God's will and I knew the truth, etc. But I wanted to prove to my family I wasn't in a cult and I wasn't brainwashed. And my father begged me with tears in his eyes to just give us a few days, listen to what these ex-members are want to share, and if you want to go back, he said, I'll drive you myself, but at least your mother and I will know we did the responsible thing. Because, they weren't convinced that I was thinking for myself, and I wasn't.
mhm,
And it was in that last day of the intervention that I realized I had an epiphany that Moon was a liar and that he couldn't be the Messiah or a man of God if he was a liar, and he couldn't be trustworthy either if he was a liar. And I realized my entire belief system for 2.5 years was based on an assumption that Moon was the Messiah and was the greatest spiritual being on earth and was going to build the kingdom of heaven on earth. And
mm,
once I took that out of the equation, it was like, what happened to me? How did I
mhm,
believe this? So I started reading books on brainwashing and mind control, sought out some of the former military intelligence experts, people like Robert J. Lifton, Margaret Singer, Lewis West, and talked with them about my being in the Moonies. And they encouraged me to study psychology because they said I knew basically more than what they knew. And it
mm,
had happened to me firsthand, and I did it to other people, and they just studied it secondhand. And I never imagined in 1976 that I would still be doing this work in 2025, much less have the President of the United States, uh, who has a malignant narcissistic personality type, which is the cult leader type,
mhm.
with all these authoritarian cults in it, with people being programmed to believe in QAnon and all kinds of crazy conspiracy theories. So I find myself, my work more important than ever. I've written
Wow.
five books, done 4 TEDx talks, and have an online course for clinicians as well as family members and ex-members to learn more about this phenomenon.
Yeah.
So
And
that's a
you
summary.
said, yeah, and your story is detailed in combating cult mind control, and it's riveting. You said several very important things there that I think sometimes people dismiss. People think of those who get involved in cults as uneducated loners
Yeah,
who are on the fringes of society. That could never happen to me. You were an educated young Jewish boy from a good home. You weren't from a broken home. You
right.
weren't on drugs. It wasn't any of those things. And that moment of vulnerability was the gateway because every person has moments of vulnerability in their life.
Correct.
So
Exactly.
how did they manage? So, because it helps us to go to understanding how cults operate. How did they manage to infiltrate in? And there's the combination of what we talk about with brainwashing, which is a term that gets thrown around a lot, versus the idea of mind control. And mind
Hmm.
control is really more where this comes into play. Could you talk a little bit about the differences and how it worked in your case?
Sure. So, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but first
Hmm.
let me just start by saying social psychology has taught us a lot about the fact that humans are social beings, that we like to think we're individuals, but we really are very socialized beings. We
Hmm.
also suffer from a whole bunch of biases, unconscious biases. And one of the most important principles of social psychology is called the fundamental attribution error,
Hmm.
which is fancy terminology for saying that when humans look at other humans and try to figure out why they do what they do, there's a bias to overestimate personality or disposition and underestimate the social context and
Hmm.
the social influences. So walking around thinking it could never happen to me because I'm too smart is people's biggest vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
And that's one of the first points I want your listeners to understand is we're human, we're all vulnerable, and be humble. And you don't know what you don't know. And that's why it's so important to reality test. I was reading Extra Honor postgraduate level when I was 8 and 9 years of age, skipped eighth grade. So, and I can tell you, I've helped thousands of people who are brilliant, often, top students in their universities, valedictorians. So, what, so I lost my train of thought, Chad. What was the other part of your question?
No, you were doing great. Yeah. So to talk a little bit about helping the people to understand brainwashing,
Oh,
which many
brainwashing,
people
right.
associate with cult versus mind control.
Right, thank you. So, brainwashing was a term coined in the 50s by Edward Hunter, and it evokes an image of a blackboard with writing on it, and someone takes a wet sponge and washes the blackboard and then starts putting new writing on it. And that's not what the phenomenon is about at all. Speaking as a mental health professional, the best way to describe it is it's a dissociative disorder, which means that the old Steve Hassan, who was 19 years old, who had his own mind, his own values, his own goals, etc., was still there, but the Mooney identity got programmed into alongside or superior to the real me. And he believed he was evil and satanic, and he was following true father and mother and was part of God's plan on earth. But the reason why I'm going into this is that when I hear people say, so and so's in a cult, they'll never leave, it's just not true. Or people following Trump can never be helped to reevaluate. It's just not fun. It's fundamentally flawed, and it's just not
Hmm.
true. So the key thing is understanding what is mind control, and I've defined it in terms of four overlapping variables, but I want to emphasize that my model and my work is based on the Chinese communist brainwashing experts like Lifton and Singer and West. But basically, my model, we call it the BITE model:
Hmm.
behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. They're overlapping variables, and if you can control those four elements, you can control someone's identity and sense
Hmm.
of reality. And again, it's important to understand, and that's why I have a free model that's on my freedomofmind.com website called the influence continuum, where people can understand here's ethical influence, where you have informed consent, respect for your conscience, it's love-based, it's creative, has you have free will, critical thinking, all the way to the authoritarian bite model
Hmm.
programming, where people will obey, kill on command, die on command, etc. And so my whole approach is psychoeducational. It's sharing what I've learned and helping people know how to talk effectively to people whose minds have been co-opted. And what I can say, Chad, what doesn't work is arguing logic or facts, attacking the leader, the doctrine, or the policies head on. Why?
Hmm.
Because it activates the cult identity to defend and to
Hmm.
perceive you as the enemy, and they're being persecuted by you.
Yeah.
So you never want to do a frontal attack. What you want to do is be warm, friendly, ask respectful, curious questions. And it turns out a good question and then being silent for an extended period of time while the person thinks about it is the single most powerful technique for helping people to reevaluate for themselves that what they're doing isn't what they really want to be doing. And so it's what doesn't work is a persuasion method. What works is a reality testing invitation method. And when it comes to people in Trump's orbit, talking about Chinese communist brainwashing and talking about pimps and traffickers and how they do what they do to co-opt people and make them good citizens or good slaves, understanding the bite model here and here, then you can ask questions that will help people think back before they ever met the group or met Trump. What was persuasive to them? What assumptions were they accepting that they didn't test?
I love that. And I want to touch on something here because you mentioned Trump on a few occasions.
Hmm.
Most people associate the idea of cult with religion exclusively.
Right,
And one of the things that I have seen in my work is you have any number of people who, when you talk about the idea of the cult of Trump, they dismiss that immediately because they're part of the Christian right. And I no, I'm not part of a cult. I'm part of the Christian church, and
right.
therefore I'm not in a cult. But as you talk about in your work, cults are not exclusively religious. Can you
Right.
describe the different types of cults that people can be involved in?
Yeah, great question. But first, I'll just say, and it's something that I get asked this question all the time by the media, about cults. And for me, cults exist along the entire continuum. So there are fan groups that are culty. There are
Hmm.
movies that people describe as cult classics,
Yeah.
etc. So my worry is with authoritarian cults, mind
Hmm.
control cults that disrupt the person's sense of self. But to answer your question, we have everything from one-on-one abusive relationships, typically with a narcissist controlling somebody. We have psychotherapy cults, large group awareness training cults, multi-level marketing cults, political cults, religious cults, and I believe China, for example, is a political cult, communist cult,
Mm.
because it's pyramid structured, bite model, ends justify the means, everyone needs to be obedient, etc. And one of the things when I was writing The Cult of Trump that I started with was the knowledge, because I grew up in Queens and I knew Donald Trump throughout my childhood, in the media at least,
Hmm.
that he was a narcissist, and the stereotypical profile of cult leaders is what's called malignant narcissists, which is more extreme version where the person thinks they're above the law, they're pathological liars, they're sadistic, they're paranoid, they're revengeful. There's a whole list that Eric Fromm developed. So I just started with that, saying I can write this book, The Cult of Trump, based on he's got a cult of personality, that every business he's done, he has this influence over people. But as I researched more and more, I realized there were actual authoritarian cults in the cult of Trump and controlling the cult of Trump. So chapter 7 talks about puppet masters, and chapter 8 are followers. And my book first came out in 2019, It was re-released in 2024 with a foreword by George Conway and an afterword
Mhm.
by myself. But in 2019, I put Putin at the top of the Puppet Master chapter. And
Mhm.
it was very interesting because when I submitted the manuscript to my editor, uh, I had Putin at the top, and then the Mueller report just came out, and Bill Barr said there was no Russian collusion. And my editor said, "You got to take out Putin." And I'm like, "Over my dead body." And Fortunately, they didn't insist, and Putin was in there. But the evidence, overwhelming evidence, is that he was actually approached by the KGB in the 80s and recruited as an asset because after his first trip to Russia, he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times against NATO,
Hmm.
which was a Soviet Union plus for him to, as an American business person, to say something like that.
Mhm.
In any case, so there are many religious cults in the cult of Trump. The Moonies are in it,
Yeah.
Scientology, which never had religious tax exemption for 25 years, and they did fraud and sued the IRS and got it.
Yeah.
Falun Gong, who does the Epoch Times, is in the cult of Trump. But the biggest blocks of people are Christian Dominionists, Seven Mountain Dominionists, New Apostolic Reformation,
Mhm.
Opus Dei, a group called The Family that Jeffrey Charlotte has a 5-part Netflix series on and 2 New York Times best-selling books. And for many of these other cults, they're following the leader of their group who's telling them to follow Trump.
Mhm.
They're not following Trump directly.
Mm.
There are people who follow Trump directly, but they're not Christians. They're not in organized groups per se.
Yeah. And you add on to that the number of, in particular in the Protestant world, the number of evangelical non denominational pastors that have used their influence from the pulpit in order to get their congregations to follow. And they're not necessarily considered to be cults, but that's a tremendous amount of influence that has allowed the Christian right to gain overwhelming influence and be able to pass legislation in states around the country using that level of voting power that they have developed.
Yeah, and people have asked me, if you voted for Trump, does that make you a cult member? And my answer is no, not necessarily.
Mhm.
People may have voted Republican their whole lives and just don't feel comfortable voting for anything but a Republican. But at 2025, when we're recording this, I'd say anyone who actually believes that Trump won the 2020 election, despite overwhelming evidence, including evidence from 60 courts and Bill
Yeah.
Barr and Chris Krebs, the person that Trump appointed to be in charge of voting. If you believe that Trump won the 2020 election, or you believe January 6th was not a violent attempt to subvert the peaceful transfer of power, then I say you're in the cult of Trump.
Yeah.
And, and regarding the New Apostolic Reformation groups, these groups have people claiming to be prophets or apostles, Chad, who
Mhm.
claim to speak directly to God, and they are doing a lot of opposite of what Jesus taught about
Sure.
send me money, the more money you send me, the more you'll be blessed, the whole prosperity thing, or
Mhm.
Jesus was like, render unto Caesar what Caesar's, my kingdom is not of this world. The Seven Mountain Dominionists want to take over the world
Mhm. Yeah.
politically and financially, etc. So they do
Yeah.
operate like cults,
Mhm.
destructive cults.
And that push in any number of those circles towards, kind of think about the Moonies, the theocratic system, wanting
Yeah.
to buck the United States Constitution to create a full-blown Christian state, Christian state, right? Depending on how one defines Christian, but their view of Christian. May I ask from just a psychological standpoint, what is it about these malignant narcissists that draws people to them?
Um, I would say a lot of narcissists and malignant narcissists do not start mind control cults. They're around and they may prey on a person at a time, a wife or a husband or something.
Hmm.
But they're very charming, they're very flattering, they know how to push buttons. And what's so tricky with narcissists and especially malignant narcissists is that average people can't comprehend the mindset that a person who's a malignant narcissist has. It would
Hmm.
be incomprehensible for the average person to think about telling a big lie over and over again and having no moment of hesitation or doubt or admitting that they're wrong.
Hmm.
There's a interesting man that I whose book I read and whose videos I've watched over the years. He wrote a book called Self-Malignant Love, and he was a narcissist himself. His name is Sam Vaknin, and his work is fascinating because he talks and teaches people how he thinks and how narcissists operate.
Oh, interesting.
And especially when I'm asked to help a young girl, for example, adolescent, young teen girl, I like to show one of his videos how to know if you're with a narcissist or psychopath on the first date. And he
Hmm.
goes through a litany of how charming and flattering he is, and he makes you this feel like you're the center of the universe, and his whole life is now fulfilled that he's met you,
Hmm.
and tells, story after story after story, but then he gives clues about how the guy might treat the waiter if you're out to dinner. Poorly is the answer,
Hmm.
or as an object that everybody's about pleasing him,
Yeah.
etc. But they're very charming. They are very emotionally charismatic, certainly in Trump's case. And he also, I believe, learned NLP and hypnosis, part of his conquest of long lines of women. I would add that historic relationship with Epstein and before Epstein and since Epstein. People who take advantage sexually of other people, it's not about love, it's about power. It's
Hmm.
power over.
Yeah. And yeah, and it really is. It's so, if it weren't so at times frightening as to see how, how this cult of Trump has consumed people, like you talk about all the QAnon stuff, what happened at January 6th, the fact that he's now back in the White House, it's just astonishing to think that anybody who was convicted of 34 felonies, yeah, and but even when he was convicted of felonies, it was all persecution, right? You create that he's a messianic figure,
Right.
and and so by taking that messianic model that the Messiah is a persecuted Jesus figure,
Mm,
you can create this entire apologetic, which is what's been done, to justify the fact that even if he is convicted, he didn't really do it. And
hmm.
it's so fascinating because it touches on that issue of the mind control, the way that people can be mentally conditioned to
Yeah,
where immediately, I love that image you had, the wall comes up, that immediate defense mechanism goes into play, and
yeah,
how can I protect him from whatever may come at him?
yep.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of projection.
Mhm.
He labels the opponents as liars when he's the liar. He
Yeah.
attacks the opponents as wanting to do a coup when he was trying to do the coup. And what I want to explain to you and your listeners is that the mind We have an unconscious mind and we have a conscious mind. And Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for his book for behavioral economics called Thinking Fast and Slow. And in this book, he talks about how we are operating unconsciously all the time with mental heuristics that have developed over our lifetime
Hmm.
to quickly assess and categorize what's happening and to know how to behave or how to react to a situation. Our conscious mind is much more narrow, more concentrated, and can only handle a certain amount of information at any given moment. And basically what a lot of what Trump has been doing and the right-wing media machine has been doing is misdirecting people's attention. So he has a problem, saying that he's grabbing women's genitals and how happy women are that he does that. And then the next minute, Roger Stone is told to release WikiLeaks against the Democrats, and
Hmm.
the attention moved for what should have gotten him out of the first round of presidential nominees, guaranteed, now is all about the Democrats, etc. And the technique that they've been using is also a Russian technique called active measures of overload.
Hmm.
So it's
Yep.
not just diverting your attention, but making another outrageous statement and another outrageous statement and another outrageous action. So much so the media and people's attention gets overwhelmed. And when people are overwhelmed or overloaded, it's one of the major mind control techniques. People don't like to feel overloaded. They don't like to feel confused. And there's an adaptive mechanism where our critical thinking goes offline and we're reacting more emotionally. I'm pointing to the amygdala
Hmm.
in the back brainstem, that where we just want certainty. And the way the lower parts or limbic parts of our brain works is if we hear the same thing, even if it's a lie, over and over and over again, but it's said with certainty, we start adapting and believing that it's true. Even
Hmm.
though we know that it's not true intellectually, it
Hmm.
feels better to accept it because
Yeah.
it's been over and over and over. So it's very fascinating. And I can tell
Hmm.
you that I was recruited in 1974. I got deprogrammed in 76. The world has changed, Chad, since the digital universe was created, and
Hmm.
things are getting more and more sophisticated and
Yep.
more difficult to assess what's real, what's not real, what's a deep fake, what's AI. And humans are not equipped for how to handle the onslaught of information that's coming at us and
Yeah.
disinformation by foreign actors who want to do us ill will, who have ill
Hmm.
will for us. So we really need to come back to the real world. We need to sleep 7 to 9 hours a night. We need to
Yes.
turn off our cell phones an hour to 2 hours before we go to sleep. We need to go to sleep at the same time and wake up at the same time and eat good food and exercise. And we need to do things in the real world and not just be on phones or on our computers all day long because it's not real.
Yes.
It's not real. And now they're developing AIs with intimacy where people are falling in love with a
Yep.
robot,
Yeah.
and it's like not real. It's not human. It's just an algorithm that's responding, but it tricks people
Hmm.
into forming a relationship with it.
Yeah.
And I'm all for, having a great relationship with your dog, or your cat, where you stroke them and you pet them and they lick you and all that good stuff. And I don't know about you, but I felt like my dogs knew me and I knew my
Hmm.
dog, and some dogs even start looking like their owners and vice versa. But
Hmm.
we're in a new dimension now where people are wearing virtual reality headsets and they're making robot androids to be your
Yes.
companions. And I just think it's very dangerous.
It's like we're living in a Stanley Kubrick film, right? That's where we are in 2025. It's a
Yeah,
Kubrick.
except even his movie, it didn't imagine just how advanced things are now. But
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
important thing that I want your listeners to know is we need to know our values.
Mm.
And I'm grateful to this Pope who's like speaking up for immigrants, for justice, for global warming, for like real life issues,
Hmm.
because the fossil fuel countries and corporations don't want you thinking
No.
about fossil fuels because they make more money and they get more power by
Yeah.
keeping it up. But they're killing our habitat, and what's going to be left for our children and our grandchildren and for all the other species is going to be a dead planet
Hmm.
if we don't really stop and go, what are we doing here, people?
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, and I think it's very important. Well, you talked a little bit about the fact that we all have implicit biases, which is just it's ingrained into our brain. And yet, what we see around the country is not just states who are outlawing the teaching of implicit bias, but organizations that are actually working to sue on behalf of clients so they do not have to undergo any form of implicit bias training. The
Mm,
efforts to stamp out education that seeks to help people understand basic realities of our brain is also under assault. And
absolutely.
that's something to be aware of is when people stand in the way of good education to help us learn to think for ourselves and to treat education as education is just exclusively about vocation, it's not about thinking. There's dangerous trends at hand, and it's important for people to continue to search for that information, which is one of the reasons why Freedom of Mind is such an important organization, because you are
Mm.
bringing those resources. Do you work at Freedom of Mind with people who have also been damaged by groups that would not necessarily be deemed cults, but are coming out of trauma from religion?
Sure,
Okay.
sure. So one of the characteristics of thought control on the bite model is black and white thinking, us
Hmm.
versus them, good versus evil, this very binary all or nothing thinking,
Hmm.
which is more characteristic of a young child than of an evolved adult.
Yeah.
And what I want your listeners to understand is that reality is complex, and when people take a complex situation and reduce it to an all or nothing or an us versus them, they should have a rebellion in their mind going, what's missing from this formula? Like what has been left out of this computation and such? Because the healthiest thing for us as a species, in terms of how did we get so advanced over all the other species on Earth, I believe a big part of it, aside from language acquisition and opposable thumb, is the development of the scientific method.
Hmm.
And there's been a out and out assault on experts and science
Yes.
since the 80s. And I point to William Lind and Paul Weyrich teaming up together to attack experts and science, partly because they're fossil fuel corporations, partly because some of the literalists think the Earth is 6,000 years old
Yep.
and they don't want people to know about dinosaurs and fossils. I've counseled people in the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints who thought that there was no such thing as dinosaurs, that was all
Yep.
made up. or we never made it to the moon. That was just the
Oh
stage
yeah.
event and such. What I want to say about the scientific method is unlike true believing, religions where people say some so and such is the truth. It's the inerrant word of God, the truth with a capital T. Science doesn't say something's true like that. It says we have a hypothesis and we test it. And then we subject that hypothesis to a community of scientists and anyone else to disprove it.
Hmm.
And there's a commitment to abandoning a false hypothesis or one that isn't as explanatory if it comes along. So it's this notion that we don't know everything. There's so much more we don't know. Let's find out. Let's keep expanding our knowledge versus having a frame of we know what the truth is and we're only going to look for confirmation, what's called confirmation bias. We're only
Hmm.
going to look for confirmation of our existing beliefs, and anything that raises a doubt is evil. So we're going to label it
Yes.
as demonic
Hmm.
instead of
Yeah.
be curious and go, tell me more.
Yeah. And that's really prevalent, especially in the world of conservative Christianity, looking at the way in which dogma or appealing to, say, Nicaea. We're appealing to the wisdom of a group of bishops from the year 325 CE. Right?
Yeah,
Nothing has changed since 325, right? Like, a lot's changed, but being able to appeal to that small window
right,
and try to confirm everything through that prism. For
right.
some people, it brings a sense of comfort and control over their lives because opening up and actually having to expand and really deal with issues, that can be frightening for people.
Yeah, for sure. The world is complex and overwhelming. And so beliefs and the way our brains work is to narrow the chaos, to get rid of noise and other extraneous things so that we can be functional.
Yeah,
And not every person needs to know everything about every subject, but it definitely helps to not just be in one subject and ignore other areas because things are interrelated.
sure. Yeah.
So for
So,
me, art,
uh
science, physics, go ahead.
no, no, perfect. Because what I'm kind of, I think you're bringing something important to this, which is you have an encompassing approach to this. And that brings me to the question of the services, because one thing we really want to highlight is freedom of mind
Mm.
and the various services that freedom of mind offers people. So, what I wanted to ask is what are some of the services that freedom of mind provides people who want to come to you to try to find some help?
So I feel frustrated that I don't have more to offer people at this moment. I've written books, I have online courses. I want to do more courses. I am doing messaging and writing blogs and interviewing people for my podcast. But
Hmm.
in this stage of my career, I'm starting to wind down my practice where I'm actually meeting with people, doing consultations, and advising them how to help a loved one. So part of my effort is to train other clinicians and other people who are
Mm,
interested in learning how my methodology works and cultivating many more people that are out there. I do have a free anonymous survey at bitemodel.com, which is an extension of my doctoral dissertation research, which asked 132 questions of the bite model. It's a rather extensive model. You can go to Freedom of Mind and download the whole list of variables. We took 40 of the highest factor loading questions and made them into what's called the Likert scale of doesn't apply to applies. And
mm,
people can do a free anonymous self-evaluation of whatever relationship or group that they're in. And it will actually give a number of how authoritarian the group they're in is. So it's a tool that people can use. And then, if people say, I want to know more. So I tell them to read my books, take my courses, and stay tuned as I'm trying to build more of a movement of freedom of mind.
Hmm.
And just talking about politics again for a minute, there are tens of millions of former cult members in the United States. And yes, there are tens of millions of cult members, but there's a lot more of us ex-members or people who were raised in a dictatorship as children who left. And if they can educate themselves about these models and share their story with others, it will create a normalcy to counter the nonsense that's happening right now
Mm.
around the country and around the world. Because a lot of people think you have to be stupid to get into a cult. So I'm not going to admit that I got duped by Trump, except
Hmm.
it's starting to happen in more and more frequency with
Yeah.
vets, for example, who've lost their jobs, who are getting their VA benefits cut, are starting to speak out. In fact, Saturday is a big protest meeting in DC of veterans. I don't know if you were aware of that. Big
Mm-mm.
meeting in DC. And on the 14th, around the entire United States, there's a No King's Day
Yes.
protest where people are being asked to turn out locally, even if just a few neighbors, but just to say, I'm against what's happening. I'm for the Constitution. I'm for the separation of church and state. I'm for rule of law. I'm not
Hmm.
for militias going around with masks on, masquerading as police, threatening people. It's just not okay. It's not the America that we grew up and love.
Yeah. So you also, because this is actually very much of interest to me, you offer training to for folks like me to be able to help others who have been
Sure.
indoctrinated. Oh,
Anyone
awesome.
who approaches me and at the moment I'm waiting for some generous donors to show up and say, "Hey, Steve, train, Westar, here's
Mm,
some money for your time and effort." And I'd love to.
okay.
I would love to do it. Literally, the money that I'm making is paying my team to put my message out because I
Okay.
feel like it's so urgent.
Yes.
So that's what we're doing.
Great. And I will get in contact with you because this is something near and dear to my heart, which is one of the reasons why I connected with you. So as a wrap up, I mean, what's your final recommendation to someone right now who maybe is overwhelmed or they're just kind of curious about this?
Well, I want to tell people you need to sleep 7 to 9 hours a night. If you're feeling burned out, you have to pay attention to your body and take care of it and eat well and have real life friends.
Yeah.
I also think it's very important to be active when there's an overwhelming threat. People tend to fight, flight, um, uh, freeze, or fawn. Those are the four
Hmm.
things. Fawn is like go along with it.
Yeah.
And I think fighting is the only viable real option long term. I mean, if you want to freeze for a short amount of time, that's fine. But where are you going to flee to? You can leave the United States, but this authoritarianism is threatening everywhere around the
Yes.
world. And so I think making a stand here is the smart move. Of course, everyone has to make their own decision.
Yeah.
But I want to say if you have a family member or friend or coworker who's been a Trump supporter, don't just avoid the subject matter anymore and just say, "Hey, I respect you. I like you. I'm curious. What do you think of X? Or what do you think of Musk? Or what do you think of,
Hmm.
cutting Medicaid for veterans?" And just wait and let them think and give you a response. Because a lot of people, if you approach them with warmth and with dignity, and you give them the space to think about it, they won't like it. And then
Yeah.
the follow-up is, what do you think we can do about it? And
Hmm.
what I'm hoping is that there's tons of former Republicans who will contact their senators. Now they just voted in the House by one vote this horrendous package that will add trillions of debt by giving tax cuts to the super wealthy, but taking away benefits for the rest of us.
Hmm.
We want people to reach out, excuse me, to the GOP and just exert a lot of very powerful pressure that
Yeah.
this is not why we voted for you and this is not okay.
Hmm. You said something there very important because it's gotten so lost in much of our political discourse, which is that we all know people that are Trump supporters. That does not mean that because we feel strongly about that political worldview that we don't love those people or care for
Right.
them. But expressing both that love and the care, but also expressing the reasons for opposition. It's not an either or.
Yeah, but I would warn people from trying to tell their position without being asked it.
Hmm.
I think that the best thing is to just say I'm curious
Hmm.
how you came to believe that this man is competent to run the United States. I like to ask people, what's your first memory of Donald Trump? Because many people will say, I saw him on The Apprentice. And then I like to ask them, do you remember your first reaction to Trump? Most of the time they say he was an asshole or he was an arrogant, son of a bee or whatever. And to get people back in time and then to start thinking that's interesting. So what were the main things that got you to shift your perspective from that gut informed reaction
Hmm.
to now? And is there anything he could say or do that would make you stop and question and say, you know what? I don't want to be involved with this person anymore. And that's another thing that's worth asking any cult member is I'm curious, tell me about what you were doing before, what you were believing, how you got involved, and tell me, is there an exit ramp? And often, if it's a true believer, they'll say, no, I'm committed no matter what. I'm going to follow him to the end. I said that as a Mooney. But if I had been counseling me, if I could time travel back in time, I would say, so what if, and I would give what if scenarios to make the person think about it. And one of my favorites, Chad, is is um, is the following scenario. And Moon's dead now, so it's really hypothetical. But I would say to a Mooney, I'd say, what would happen if you're sitting in a lecture and father, because that's how Mooney's referred to him, same as Jim Jones was father, by the way. Um, what if father got up on stage and said, I've been seeing a psychiatrist lately and I'm on medication now, and I realize I'm not the Messiah. You need to go home. What would you do? So a Mooney would say, oh, he would never say that. To which I would say, "Yeah, I agree,
Hmm.
highly unlikely. But I'm curious, you're sitting there and he's telling you to go home. What would you do?" And it's a loop that's inescapable because he's ordering you to go home. You've been trained to be obedient. He's saying he's not the Messiah. But it's a thought experiment that
Yep.
is a useful one to go, is there a line that might get crossed? If I was given a gun and told to shoot my mother in the face, would I do it? Oh, he would never ask me to do that. I know, but if you were asked to do it, what would you do? Oh, I wouldn't
Yep.
do it. Okay, so there is a line for yourself.
Hmm.
Good for you. So that people don't do this all or nothing. I'll follow whatever he says blindly.
Hmm. What's your website, Steve?
Freedomofmind.com. I also have a Substack where we post blogs. I have a podcast called Cult Conversations, The Influence Continuum with Dr. Steve Hassan. I have a YouTube channel that I'm about to develop with a subscription model, Dr. Stephen Hassan. And lastly, I really want to thank you as a Christian for having me on. I think Christians have a very big role they could potentially play by sharing their faith, by sharing their knowledge of Scripture with people who've been co-opted in the cult of Trump.
Hmm. No, I appreciate that. And it's challenging because, in addition to being a Christian, I'm also a scholar. And
Right.
what I have found is kind of like what you've talked about, the increasing distrust of people who are experts. And so, even being a PhD as a historical critical scholar, that continued distrust is an effort to poison the well to just maintain the status quo.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to not emphasize the PhD if it's somebody who's been indoctrinated
Yep.
that way, but to talk about your journey and your
Hmm.
quest to know more, to understand God better, to understand the scriptures better, and emphasize that.
Yeah.
And I rarely push my PhD,
Yeah. Me
to
too.
people for
Yeah,
that reason.
absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. If you have experienced issues with mind control, if you have a loved one who is struggling with any of these issues, please go visit freedomofmind.com and you can find some resources. You can get in contact with Steve. Thank you to all of you who have tuned in for our podcast here at Bible Search and Rescue on behalf of the West Star and Chad Vinters, the host. We are so appreciative of all of you. Thank you, and go out and make the world a better place for somebody else today. Take
Yeah,
care,
that's
everybody.
awesome. Thank you.